I found Margaret Chen on a Tuesday morning in late September 2001, sitting cross-legged on a moss-covered log in the Cascade Mountains, holding up a handmade picture book to three juvenile Bigfoot creatures who were mimicking the sounds of vowels. She looked at me with the same patient expression I imagine she'd given countless second graders over her career, adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses that were held together with what appeared to be woven plant fiber, and said in a voice that hadn't spoken to another human in 22 years, "You'll have to wait. We're in the middle of a lesson." The creatures, each about 4 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown fur, didn't scatter. They just watched me with curious, intelligent eyes, while Margaret turned the page and continued teaching them the letter B. Before we continue, comment below where in the world you are watching from, and please click like and subscribe for more Bigfoot stories. My name is Dr. James Whitlock, and in 2001, I was a cultural anthropologist working with the University of Washington on a completely unrelated project about indigenous forestry practices in the North Cascades. I'd been in these mountains for 6 weeks, conducting interviews with members of the Sauk-Suiattle tribe, documenting traditional knowledge about old-growth forests. I had absolutely no interest in cryptozoology, no belief in Bigfoot, and frankly considered the whole subject a distraction from serious academic work. I had 3 published papers in peer-reviewed journals, a teaching position waiting for me in Seattle, and a reputation I'd worked 12 years to build. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to describe cost me that reputation, ended my marriage, and changed everything I thought I understood about intelligence and communication. The morning I found Margaret, I'd hiked about 7 miles into an area the Sauk-Suiattle elders had told me was traditionally avoided. They'd described it with a phrase that translated roughly to "where the forest teachers live." My guide, Robert Tushwa, had refused to take me beyond a certain ridgeline. He'd dropped me at the trailhead at 5:30 that morning with a satellite phone and a warning to be back by nightfall. The air smelled like cedar and recent rain. The temperature was 47 degrees. I'd been following game trails, looking for specific tree markers the elders had mentioned, when I heard something that didn't belong in that forest. It was a human voice, female, speaking slowly and clearly in a pattern I recognized instantly because my sister Amy had been an elementary school teacher for 15 years. It was the cadence of someone teaching phonics to young children. Long A sound, short A sound, the word apple broken into syllables. I froze, which is what you do when you hear something impossible. The nearest road was 7 miles behind me. The nearest town, Darrington, was population 1,193 people, and I'd met most of them over the past 6 weeks. None of them had any reason to be this deep in the mountains on a Tuesday morning, and certainly not to teach someone to read. I followed the voice for approximately 10 minutes, moving carefully through dense undergrowth. The forest canopy was so thick that, even though it was morning, the light had that dim, greenish quality. I wasn't trying to be quiet, but the damp forest floor absorbed sound. That's how I managed to observe for nearly 2 minutes before Margaret noticed me. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, with a fallen log that had probably been there since the 1950s, based on the decomposition and moss coverage. Margaret sat on this log like it was her desk. She wore clothes that had clearly been made from animal hides, stitched with remarkable skill using what looked like plant fiber thread. Her hair, which had probably been dark brown in 1979, was now iron grey and hung in a single long braid down her back, decorated with small white stones. She was thin but not malnourished, weathered but healthy. On the ground in front of her, arranged in a semicircle like students at story time, were 3 young Bigfoot creatures. I know what you're thinking. Hallucination, heat stroke, Contaminated water, except it was 47 degrees. I'd been drinking from sealed bottles, and what I was observing had consistent, logical detail. The creatures were clearly juveniles. Their fur was lighter than adult Bigfoot fur, as described in reports, more reddish-brown. They sat attentively, making soft hooting sounds that seemed to be attempts at mimicking the phonemes Margaret was teaching. The book she held was handmade, constructed from bark paper bound with leather straps. Each page had a hand-drawn picture and a single letter in charcoal. The drawings were remarkably good. An apple for A, a bear for B. Margaret would point to the letter, make the sound, point to the picture, say the word, then wait while the young Bigfoot creatures attempted to replicate the sound. They weren't just parroting, they were trying to shape the sounds with purpose. When she finally noticed me, I'd taken exactly 3 steps into the clearing, my mouth open, my field journal falling from my numb hands. The creatures looked at me immediately, and I expected them to bolt. Every account I'd ever read about Bigfoot emphasized their avoidance of humans. These 3 stood up, moved closer to Margaret, but they didn't run. They watched me with the cautious curiosity of children who've been taught that strangers might be dangerous but aren't automatically threats. Margaret set down her book carefully, stood up with the stiff movement of someone whose joints ache in the cold, and studied me for a long moment. Then she spoke those words that I will never forget, in a voice that was perfectly calm and rational, and somehow made the impossible situation more impossible. "You'll have to wait. We're in the middle of a lesson." I stood there like an idiot. This woman, who I would later confirm had been missing since November 1979, who had been the subject of one of the largest search efforts in Washington state history, who was legally declared dead in 1985, was telling me to wait while she finished teaching literacy to Bigfoot children. The absurdity was so complete that I laughed, not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that happens when your brain encounters something it has no framework to process. Margaret didn't laugh. She turned back to the creatures, made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, and they settled down again. She picked up her book and continued the lesson as if I wasn't there. B for bear, C for crow, D for deer. The creatures watched the pictures, made their hooting attempts at the sounds, and occasionally glanced at me with those disturbingly intelligent eyes. I realized I was watching something that shouldn't exist. Not just Bigfoot, which was impossible enough, but young Bigfoot being educated, being taught human language and literacy by a human teacher who'd been missing for 22 years. My training kicked in eventually. Anthropologists are taught to observe, to document, to suspend judgment. I picked up my field journal with shaking hands and started writing everything I saw. The time, 8:43 a.m. The temperature, approximately 47 degrees based on my earlier reading. The location, approximately 7.2 miles northeast of the trailhead where Robert had dropped me, at coordinates that I recorded from my GPS unit. The subjects, 1 adult human female, approximately 60 years old, 3 juvenile unknown primates, height approximately 4 feet, weight estimated 80 to 100 pounds each. I wrote it all in the clinical language of field notes because that was the only way I could process what I was seeing. The lesson continued for another 17 minutes. I timed it. Margaret worked through the alphabet to the letter M, using pictures that demonstrated both her artistic skill and her deep knowledge of this forest ecosystem. M was for mushroom, and the drawing showed a chanterelle so detailed I could identify the species. N was for nest, with a drawing of an eagle's nest that included the specific branch structure of an old-growth Douglas fir. When she reached the letter O, she paused, looked at the creatures with an expression of such genuine affection that my throat tightened, and said something I didn't understand at first. It wasn't English. It was a series of low hoots and clicks and what sounded almost like humming. The creatures responded with their own vocalizations, and then Margaret stood up, made a gesture that clearly meant class dismissed, and watched as the three juveniles moved off into the forest. They didn't run. They walked, occasionally looking back, until the dense undergrowth swallowed them completely. Then Margaret turned to me, and in the full light of that clearing, I could see the person she'd been and the person 22 years alone had made her. Her face was lined deeply, weathered by constant exposure to the elements. Her hands were calloused, scarred, strong. But her eyes were clear, sharp, alert. And when she smiled, it was the smile of someone who'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. "You're not a hunter," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I managed. "I'm an anthropologist, Dr. James Whitlock, University of Washington." She nodded slowly. "Margaret Chen, though I suppose you might know that already. I taught second grade at Cascade Elementary in Everett. Past tense, I assume." The casualness of her tone was almost as shocking as the situation. I had maybe 1,000 questions, but the one that came out was, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She laughed then, a sound that was surprisingly warm. "I've been more than okay, Dr. Whitlock. The question is whether you're okay. You look like you've seen a ghost, or something even less believable." She gestured to the log. "Sit down before you fall down. We should talk, but I need to know first whether you're going to be calm about this, or whether I'm going to have to convince you that you're not having a psychotic break." I sat. The log was solid, real, covered in thick moss that was slightly damp. Margaret sat beside me, maintaining a careful distance, and I noticed she kept glancing at the forest edge where the creatures had disappeared. Protective, watchful. "I documented your disappearance," I said, because my mind was grasping for anything concrete. When I was preparing for this research trip, I read about missing persons cases in the Cascades. Margaret Chen, age 37, disappeared while hiking alone in November 1979. Last seen at a trailhead near Darrington. Extensive search, no trace found. Declared dead in absentia in 1985. "Sounds about right," she said. "Except I wasn't hiking alone, and I wasn't lost. Well, not in the way they thought." She pulled her braid over her shoulder, ran her fingers through it in a gesture that seemed automatic. "What's the date today?" "September 25th, 2001. She processed this, doing the math in her head. 22 years, 10 months. Longer than I thought, but not by much. I stopped keeping precise track around the year 2000 mark. The seasons matter more than dates when you live like this. "Live like what?" I asked. And even as I said it, I knew it was a stupid question. She lived with them, with Bigfoot. That's what she'd been doing for almost 23 years, teaching their children to read. Margaret looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize over the hours that followed. It was the look of someone trying to decide how much truth another person can handle. "You saw them, the young ones. You saw what we were doing." "Yes. And you haven't run away screaming or convinced yourself you're hallucinating." "I'm an anthropologist," I said, clinging to my professional identity like a life raft. "I'm trained to observe and document. That doesn't mean I understand what I'm observing." "Fair enough." She stood up, stretched, and I noticed she moved with the careful awareness of someone who's constantly alert to their surroundings. "I'll tell you the whole story, Dr. Whitlock, but not here. We need to go somewhere more secure. The young ones have gone back to tell the elders that there's a human visitor, and before the family decides what to do about you, I'd rather have this conversation in private." She paused, seeing my expression. "The family. That's what I call them. Not a tribe, not a troop, not a clan, a family. Because that's what they are, and that's what they've been to me for 22 years, 10 months, and however many days. I followed her because what else was I going to do? We walked deeper into the forest, not following any trail I could identify, but Margaret moved with absolute confidence. She stepped over fallen logs, ducked under low branches, and navigated through dense undergrowth like someone who'd walked these paths thousands of times. Which I realized she had. For more than 2 decades, these mountains had been her home. We came to a place where a massive cedar tree had fallen years ago, creating a natural shelter between its trunk and an outcropping of moss-covered rocks. Margaret had clearly been using this spot for a long time. There were woven mats made from cedar bark, a fire pit ringed with stones, tools made from worked stone and carved wood, and perhaps most striking, a stack of at least 30 handmade books like the one I'd seen her using. She saw me staring at them. "I make about 4 books a year," she said, settling onto one of the mats and gesturing for me to sit. "The bark paper takes time to prepare properly, and I can only make so much usable charcoal for drawing. I started with the alphabet books, basic phonics, but I've progressed to simple stories now. The older juveniles can recognize about 200 words. The younger ones, like the 3 you saw today, are just starting with letter sounds." "How is this possible?" I asked, and I meant everything. How was she alive? How had she survived 22 years alone in the mountains? How had she made contact with Bigfoot? How had she convinced them to let her teach their children? How was any of this real? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer. "I need to take you back to November 1979. I was 37 years old. I'd been teaching for 14 years. I was good at it, really good. I loved those kids. But I was also desperately unhappy. I'd been married for 9 years to a man who thought my career was a hobby. I felt trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt suffocating." She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. "I started taking solo hikes that fall, long ones. I was looking for peace. Part of me was hoping I'd get lost. Not die necessarily, but just disappear. Stop being Margaret Chen, the disappointing wife." I stayed quiet, writing in my journal, documenting everything. On November 16th, 1979, I drove to a trailhead near Darrington. I told my husband I'd be back by evening. I lied. I'd packed enough supplies for 3 or 4 days. I planned to go deep, find a place to camp, and just think. She laughed without humor. Turns out I found a much more permanent solution. What happened? I hiked for about 6 hours, made camp near a stream. I was setting up my tent when I heard something big in the woods. I froze, thinking it was a bear. Then I saw it. Him. An adult male Bigfoot, probably 8 feet tall. He was maybe 40 feet away, watching me. I should have been terrified. But he didn't look like an animal. He looked intelligent, and he wasn't threatening me, just observing. She stood up, paced a few steps. I did the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever done. I spoke to him. I said, "Hello, I'm Margaret," like I was introducing myself to a new student on the first day of school. He didn't respond, obviously, but he didn't leave either. We watched each other for maybe 5 minutes. Then he made a gesture, a sort of beckoning motion with his hand, and walked away. Slowly, like he wanted me to follow. "And you followed him?" "Of course I followed him. Dr. Whitlock, I'd just seen proof that Bigfoot was real. What else was I going to do? Go back to my miserable marriage and pretend it hadn't happened?" She sat back down, pulled her braid over her shoulder again. I followed him for maybe 2 miles, deep into terrain I would never have attempted on my own. He led me to a place where several other Bigfoot were gathered. 2 females, 3 juveniles, another male, a family group. They all stopped and stared at me. I stopped and stared at them, and then one of the females made a sound, this low, melodic hooting, and the male who'd led me there responded. They were communicating about me. What did you do? I sat down, made myself as non-threatening as possible. I took out my lunch and ate it slowly while they watched. The juveniles were fascinated. One of them came closer. I held out a piece of apple. He took it, ate it, and I thought, this is it. This is the most extraordinary moment of my life. She smiled. I was wrong. Every day for the next 22 years has had moments that extraordinary, but that first contact started everything. I went back to my camp that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about them, their intelligence, their social structure. The next morning, I hiked back, spent another day observing, then another. You chose to stay. Not immediately. I went back to the trailhead eventually, but I didn't go home. I called my husband from a payphone in Darrington, told him I needed time. He was angry. I said I'd be in touch. Then I checked into a motel, bought more supplies, and hiked back. I spent 3 weeks making contact, building trust, learning their patterns. They tolerated my presence. The juveniles became comfortable with me. I started bringing books, simple picture books. I'd show them to the young ones, point at pictures, say the words. It was play at first, but I noticed they were learning, actually learning. Margaret pulled one of her handmade books from the pile. By early December, I knew I wasn't going back. I'd found something more important. These beings, these intelligent creatures that science denied existed, they'd accepted me. And I could give them something valuable. Language, literacy. I made my choice. I hiked back to the trailhead one last time, left my car keys under the seat, left a note saying I was sorry. Then I walked into these mountains and never left. The magnitude of what she was describing settled over me. Your family must have thought you were dead. I know. I've thought about that a lot over the years, the pain I caused. But I also can't say I regret it. That probably makes me terrible. But I found my purpose here. These creatures, this family, they needed me. I've taught 4 generations now, developed a curriculum, documented their language, their social structures, their intelligence, made discoveries that would revolutionize science, and I've kept it all secret because I know what would happen if the world found out. They'd become specimens. This forest would be invaded, their lives destroyed. She looked at me with intensity. Which brings us to you, Dr. Whitlock. You've seen what I'm doing. You've seen them. You've documented it. Now you have to choose. What matters more? Your career, your reputation, your place in the scientific community, or protecting something extraordinary? I didn't answer right away because I didn't know how to answer. Everything she'd said made a terrible kind of sense. I understood the choice she'd made. I even understood why she'd made it. But I had a life, a career, responsibilities. I had Linda waiting for me back in Seattle. I had papers to write, students to teach, a future I'd carefully planned. Could I really throw that away to protect creatures that supposedly didn't exist? I need time to process this, I said finally. Margaret nodded. Fair enough. But while you're processing, let me show you something else, something that might help you understand why this matters so much. She stood up, gathered a few items, including one of her books, and gestured for me to follow. There's a member of the family I want you to meet, the matriarch. She's the one who first accepted me. She's also the first one I taught to read. Her name, as close as I can approximate it in English, is Soft Rain. She's approximately 45 years old. She's a grandmother, and she can read at about a 4th grade level. We walked for another 20 minutes, climbing higher into the mountains. Margaret moved with easy confidence, occasionally pointing out things I would have missed. claw marks on a tree trunk where a juvenile had been climbing. A carefully constructed sleeping nest hidden in dense undergrowth. Evidence of a deliberate path system that the family used to move through their territory. She showed me their world, and with every step, I understood more deeply how long she'd been part of it. We came to another clearing, this one larger, with several massive boulders creating natural windbreaks. Sitting on one of these boulders in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through the canopy was the largest Bigfoot I'd seen yet. She was maybe 7 feet tall, broader than the male Margaret had described, with dark brown fur that had patches of grey, particularly around her face. She looked old in the way that wise beings look old, weathered but vital. When she saw Margaret, she made a soft hooting sound that was clearly greeting. Margaret responded with her own vocalizations, that mixture of hoots and clicks and humming that I'd heard her use with the juveniles. Then she held up the book she'd brought. "Soft Rain, I've brought a visitor, another teacher. He needs to see what you can do." What happened next would have made me question my sanity if I hadn't already abandoned all pretense of rational explanation. Soft Rain climbed down from her boulder with surprising grace, approached Margaret with obvious affection, and took the book carefully in her massive hands. She settled onto the ground, opened the book to the first page, and began to read. Not out loud, not in English, but she was clearly reading. Her eyes moved across the page, following the text. Her finger, huge and covered in coarse hair, traced under the words. When she finished a page, she looked up at Margaret for approval before turning to the next one. Margaret smiled, nodded, made encouraging sounds. I watched a Bigfoot read a book. I watched her comprehend it, respond to it, engage with it as a literate being. And I understood in that moment that everything I thought I knew about intelligence, about consciousness, about the boundaries between human and animal, was inadequate to explain what I was witnessing. When Soft Rain finished the book, she closed it carefully and handed it back to Margaret. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes that held unmistakable intelligence and something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or assessment. She made a sound, a questioning hoot, and Margaret responded. They had a back-and-forth exchange that lasted maybe 30 seconds, Margaret's vocalizations mixing with Soft Rain's, a genuine conversation in a language I couldn't begin to understand. Finally, Margaret turned to me. "She wants to know if you're afraid of her. I told her you're surprised, but not afraid. Was I right?" I thought about it. Was I afraid? This creature could kill me without effort. She outweighed me by probably 400 pounds. She could crush my skull with one hand. But no, I wasn't afraid. I was awed, humbled, completely overwhelmed, but not afraid. "Tell her I'm honored to meet her," I said. "Tell her I think she's extraordinary." Margaret translated, or I assume she did. Soft Rain listened, then made a sound that might have been laughter, a huffing, chuffing noise. She reached out one massive hand, and before I could react, she very gently touched my shoulder. Patted it almost. Then she moved past me back toward the forest, pausing once to look back before disappearing into the undergrowth. Margaret and I stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "Now you understand. This isn't about proving Bigfoot exists. This is about protecting a family, an intelligent, social, emotionally complex family that deserves to live in peace without becoming the subject of human exploitation. Soft Rain has grandchildren, great-grandchildren. She's taught some of them the basics I taught her. There's a generational transfer of knowledge happening here, Dr. Whitlock. Cultural evolution in real time, and it needs to stay hidden." We walked back to her shelter as the afternoon light began to fade. My mind was racing, trying to process everything, trying to figure out what I was going to do. Margaret made a small fire, the first time I'd seen her do so, and we sat in the growing darkness while I asked her questions, and she answered them with the patience of a natural teacher. She told me about the family's social structure, their communication systems, their diet and foraging patterns. She told me about the births she'd witnessed, the deaths she'd mourned. She described their emotional lives, their play behaviors, their conflicts and reconciliations. She showed me years of accumulated knowledge, handwritten on bark paper, a complete ethnography of a species that wasn't supposed to exist. As night fell completely, she looked at me across the fire. "You need to make a decision, Dr. Whitlock. What are you going to do with what you've learned today?" I looked at my journal, filled with observations that would make me either famous or infamous, depending on whether anyone believed me. I thought about Linda, waiting for me back in Seattle, expecting me to return with mundane notes about indigenous forestry practices. I thought about my colleagues, my department chair, the academic world that valued proof and replication and peer review. Everything I'd been trained to value demanded that I document this, publish it, share it with the scientific community. But I also thought about Soft Rain's eyes, the way the three young Bigfoot had sat so attentively during their reading lesson, the handmade books stacked carefully in Margaret's shelter, evidence of decades of patient teaching. The trust it must have taken for this family to accept a human into their midst. The vulnerability they'd shown me today simply by existing in my presence. "I need to think," I said again, and I hated how inadequate that sounded. "Can I come back tomorrow? Continue this conversation?" Margaret studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, but Dr. Whitlock, understand something. Tomorrow I'm going to tell you things that will make today look simple. I'm going to show you things that will challenge every assumption you have about language, intelligence, and consciousness. And then you're really going to have to choose, because once you know everything, there's no unknowing it. No going back to the comfortable certainty of what science says is possible." She stood up, began banking the fire. "You should go back before Robert sends a search party. Can you find your way?" I checked my GPS, marked the coordinates of her shelter. "Yes." "Good. Come back at first light. Bring your journal, your recorder, whatever tools you use to document your research. Because if you're going to make this decision, you need to make it with complete information. You need to see everything." The hike back was surreal. I used my headlamp to navigate, my mind spinning with everything I'd witnessed. I'd left that morning as a conventional academic researcher. I was returning as someone who'd crossed a threshold into impossible territory. The forest seemed different now, full of hidden intelligence, watched by eyes I couldn't see. I found myself wondering how many times I'd been observed during my 6 weeks in these mountains without knowing it. How many times had the family watched me, assessed me, decided I was safe to ignore? I reached the trailhead at 9:47 p.m., exhausted physically and mentally. Robert's truck was still there, and he was sitting on the tailgate, drinking coffee from a thermos. He looked up when I emerged from the trail, his expression unreadable. "You found something," he said. Not a question. I hesitated. "What makes you say that?" "The way you're walking, the look on your face. I've seen it before, on others who went into that part of the forest and came back changed." He poured a cup of coffee, handed it to me. "The elders say some people are called to meet the forest teachers. Some people are ready to learn. You're one of them, Dr. Whitlock." I took the coffee, let its warmth steady my shaking hands. "If I told you what I saw today—" "Don't," he interrupted gently. "Not yet. Not until you've decided what you're going to do with the knowledge. Some things are meant to stay in the forest. Some things are meant to be shared. But the choice has to be yours, made with full understanding of the consequences. The elders can't make it for you. Margaret can't make it for you. You have to choose." He knew. He'd known all along. The Sauk Suiattle tribe had been protecting this family for generations, keeping their secret, maintaining the boundaries. I was the outsider, the academic, the one who could either help maintain that protection or destroy it with my need for scientific validation. "I'm going back tomorrow," I said. Robert nodded. "I thought you might. I'll be here at 5:30 a.m. We'll talk about it when you're ready to talk. Until then, get some rest. You're going to need it." I barely slept that night. I lay in my motel room in Darrington, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of what I'd witnessed. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and sat at the small desk, transcribing my field notes into more coherent form, trying to capture every detail while it was fresh. The 3 juveniles with their reddish-brown fur. Margaret's handmade books. Soft Rain reading with her massive finger, tracing under the words. The way the family had accepted Margaret, not just as an observer, but as a teacher, a member of their community. None of it made sense according to everything I'd been taught, and yet I'd seen it with my own eyes. At 5 a.m., I packed my recorder, extra batteries, my camera, though I suspected Margaret wouldn't allow photographs, and 3 notebooks. I drove to the trailhead in darkness, my headlights cutting through morning mist. Robert was already there, truck idling, 2 thermoses of coffee on the dashboard. He handed me one without a word, and we stood in the pre-dawn cold, breathing steam, not speaking. Finally, as the first light began to grey the eastern sky, he said, "My grandfather told me about Margaret. Not her name, but about a woman who came to the forest broken and found healing with the family. He said she had a gift for teaching, that she understood the young ones needed bridge knowledge, knowledge that connected their world to ours without destroying what made them who they were." "How long has your tribe known about them?" I asked. "Since the beginning, since our people first came to these mountains. We've always known. We've always protected them. It's part of our responsibility as caretakers of this land." He looked at me steadily. "The question is whether you'll join that protection or violate it. That's what you're deciding today." I hiked in as the sun rose, following the GPS coordinates I'd marked. The forest was different in morning light, less ominous, almost welcoming. Birds sang. A deer watched me pass, unafraid. I felt like I was walking into a cathedral, a place of profound significance that demanded reverence. I found Margaret's shelter easily this time. She was awake, tending a small fire, roasting what looked like mushrooms on flat stones. She looked up as I approached and smiled. "Right on time, Dr. Whitlock. Good. We have a lot to cover today." She handed me a portion of the mushrooms. "Eat first. You'll need your strength." We ate in companionable silence, and then she stood. "Come, there's someone else who wants to meet you, the patriarch, Soft Rain's mate. His name, as close as I can translate it, is Thunder Walking. He's the eldest of the family, about 55 years old, and he's been watching you since you entered their territory 6 weeks ago." My stomach dropped. 6 weeks? "They knew about you from your first day here. They watched you conducting your interviews, taking your photographs of trees, making your recordings. They discussed whether you were a threat. They decided you weren't. But they also decided that if you ever came deep enough to find them, it would be because you were meant to." Thunder Walking believes in what he calls the calling. Some humans are called to bridge the worlds. I was one. He thinks you might be another. We walked for maybe 30 minutes, deeper into terrain that showed no human trails. Margaret moved with absolute confidence, occasionally making soft vocalizations that I realized were signals to the family, letting them know we were coming. We climbed over a ridge and down into a valley I hadn't known existed, hidden by the terrain in a way that would never show up on aerial surveys. There, in a clearing beside a stream, was the family. Not just the 3 juveniles I'd seen yesterday, but 12 Bigfoot of varying ages. 2 massive adults who had to be thunder walking, and another male. 3 females including soft rain, 7 juveniles and young adults. They were engaged in what looked like morning activities. Some were grooming each other, others were gathering plants from the stream bank. The youngest were playing, a rough-and-tumble game that looked remarkably like tag. They all stopped when they saw me. Complete silence fell over the clearing. I froze, suddenly aware that I was vastly outnumbered by creatures who could kill me with minimal effort. But Margaret walked forward calmly, made a series of vocalizations, and one of the massive males stood up from where he'd been sitting. Thunder walking. He was enormous, maybe 8.5 feet tall, probably 900 pounds, with dark fur that had silver streaks through it. His face was deeply lined, scarred in places, weathered by decades of mountain life. But his eyes, when they focused on me, held an intelligence that was unmistakable. He studied me for a long moment, then made a sound, a deep, rumbling hoot that reminded me of distant thunder. Margaret responded, and they had a conversation that lasted perhaps 2 minutes. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing. Finally, Thunder Walking approached me. Each step was deliberate, measured. He came within 5 feet and stopped. Then he did something I didn't expect. He held out his hand, palm up, in what was clearly a gesture learned from Margaret. A handshake, an offering of peace. I looked at Margaret. She nodded encouragement. I stepped forward and placed my hand in his. His palm was enormous, calloused, warm. He closed his fingers gently around my hand, careful not to crush it, and we stood there in what could only be described as a formal greeting. Then he released me, made another sound, and gestured toward a flat rock near the stream. Margaret translated. He says you may sit, you may observe, you may learn, but you may not bring others here. You may not speak of this place to those who would exploit it. He says the choice to share knowledge is always the learner's, but the choice to protect the vulnerable is the teacher's burden. He wants to know if you understand the difference. I sat on the designated rock, my legs suddenly weak. Tell him I understand. Tell him I'm honored by his trust. Margaret translated. Thunder Walking listened, then made a gesture that I interpreted as approval. He returned to his spot, and gradually the family resumed their activities. But now I could watch openly, and Margaret sat beside me, narrating what I was seeing. That's morning dew, she said, pointing to one of the females who was teaching 2 juveniles how to identify edible plants. She's Soft Rain's daughter, about 25 years old, an excellent mother, very patient. Those are her children, Mist and Stone. They're 6 and 8 if you translate their development to human years. She pointed to another juvenile, slightly older. That's Cloudwalker. He was my first student. He's 14 now. He can read at a 6th grade level. He's teaching the younger ones what I taught him. I watched Cloudwalker settle down with 2 of the youngest juveniles, pulling out a handmade book similar to the ones I'd seen yesterday. He opened it carefully, pointed to pictures, made sounds that were clearly meant to be words. The young ones watched with the same attentive focus I'd seen before. Intergenerational knowledge transfer, cultural teaching, everything that defined human civilization happening here in this hidden valley among beings that science said didn't exist. Margaret, I said quietly, do you understand what you've accomplished here? This isn't just contact with an unknown species. This is proof of non-human literacy, non-human education, non-human culture that rivals human complexity. This changes everything we think we know about intelligence, about consciousness, about the uniqueness of human cognition. She was quiet for a moment. I know. I've thought about it a lot over the years. The papers I could write, the discoveries I could claim, the way it would revolutionize anthropology, linguistics, cognitive science. But I've also thought about what would happen the day after those papers were published. The researchers who would come, the government agencies, the curiosity seekers, the hunters who'd want proof. This valley would be invaded. The family would scatter or be captured. Everything they've built here would be destroyed. She looked at the family, her expression tender. They've given me 22 years of trust, of acceptance, of purpose. They've let me into their world not as a scientist studying subjects, but as a member of their community contributing what I could offer. I've watched their children grow. I've mourned their dead. I've celebrated their births. I've been part of something extraordinary, not by documenting it for the outside world, but by simply being present in it. That's worth more than any academic recognition. Over the next several hours, Margaret showed me the depth of what she'd accomplished. She brought out her accumulated documentation, hundreds of pages written on bark paper with charcoal and plant-based inks. Detailed observations of family structure, social hierarchies, conflict resolution, mourning practices, play behaviors, foraging strategies, tool use, and most importantly, language. She'd mapped their communication system, identifying hundreds of distinct vocalizations with specific meanings. She documented how they combined these vocalizations into complex messages, how they used gesture to supplement vocal communication, how they taught their young ones the social rules of proper communication. It was a complete language, as complex as any human language, just expressed differently. "Watch this," she said, and made a series of hoots and clicks toward thunder walking. He responded with his own vocalizations. Margaret turned to me. "I just asked him about the hunting patterns this season. He told me that the deer have been moving to higher elevations earlier than usual, probably because of the warmer temperatures. He thinks it's connected to what I've told him about climate change. He wants to know if the humans are doing anything to fix it." I stared at her. "He understands climate change. I've been teaching them about the wider world for 20 years. Basic science, ecology, human society, technology. They understand that there's a massive human civilization beyond these mountains. They understand that humans have power to change the environment on a global scale. Thunderwalking is particularly interested in conservation, in how to protect wild spaces from human development. He sees it as connected to his family's survival." She made more vocalizations. Thunderwalking responded at length. Margaret listened intently, then translated. "He says that humans are like fire. We can create warmth and light, cook food, clear land for growth. But we can also burn everything to ash if we're not careful. He says his people have survived by staying hidden from the fire. He wants to know if I think that will always be possible, or if eventually the fire will reach even these remote valleys." The question hung in the air, profound and heartbreaking. I had no good answer. Development was creeping into the Cascades. Climate change was altering ecosystems. Drones and satellites made privacy increasingly difficult. How long could a family of Bigfoot remain hidden in an increasingly connected, monitored, developed world? "What do you tell him?" I asked Margaret. "The truth, that I don't know, that I hope they can remain hidden, but that the world is changing fast. That's why I've been teaching them. I want them to understand the human world so that if they're ever discovered, they might have some chance of advocating for themselves. If they can demonstrate intelligence, language, culture, maybe they'll be treated as persons with rights rather than animals to be studied." The day progressed. I watched the family interact, observed their social dynamics, saw the obvious affection between mates and between parents and children. I watched Morning Dew nurse her youngest, saw Thunder Walking intervene gently in a dispute between two juveniles. observed soft rain teaching a young one how to weave plant fibers into cordage. Everything I saw reinforced Margaret's observations. These weren't animals, these were people. Different from humans, yes, but people nonetheless. As afternoon turned to evening, Margaret led me away from the clearing to a spot overlooking the valley. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I'm dying." The words hit me like physical impact. "What?" "Cancer. I found a lump in my breast about 8 months ago. It's growing. I can feel it spreading. I have maybe 6 months, maybe less." She said it calmly, matter-of-factly. "I've had a good life here, a meaningful life. I'm not afraid of death, but I am worried about what happens to the teaching program after I'm gone. You need medical treatment. I can get you out of here, to a hospital. No. Firm. Final. I'm not leaving them. This is my home. These are my people. I'll die here, and they'll mourn me according to their customs, and life will go on. But the children, Dr. Whitlock, the young ones who are just learning to read, the teenagers who are developing critical thinking skills. I don't want that to stop just because I'm gone." I understood then why she'd let me find her, why she was showing me everything. "You want me to continue the teaching. I want you to make an informed choice. If you choose to protect this place, to keep the secret, I respect that. You can walk away tomorrow and never speak of what you've seen. But if you choose to stay, to take over the teaching after I'm gone, you'd be giving these children something precious. You'd be giving them the tools to understand and navigate a world that might one day discover them, despite all our efforts to prevent it." The weight of what she was asking settled over me. I have a life, a career, a wife. I know. I had all those things too. I gave them up for this. I'm not asking you to make the same choice I made. I'm just asking you to consider it. Spend tomorrow with the family. Let them get to know you. See if you feel the calling that Thunder Walking spoke about. Then decide. That night, I hiked back to the trailhead again, my mind in turmoil. Robert drove me to the motel in silence. I called Linda from the payphone outside my room, told her I'd be staying a few more days, that the research was more complex than expected. She was annoyed but not surprised. This wasn't the first time I'd extended a field trip. I hung up feeling like a liar, which I suppose I was. I spent the next day with the family. Margaret gave me a basic lesson in their language, teaching me simple greetings and responses. Thunder Walking tested me, making sounds and waiting for my attempts at replication. He was patient but demanding, correcting my pronunciation until I got it closer to right. The juveniles found my attempts hilarious, their huffing laughter remarkably similar to human children's giggles. Cloudwalker, the eldest of the students, brought me one of the books and asked me to read it. Margaret translated his request. I read slowly, pointing to the pictures as Margaret had taught me, sounding out the words. Cloudwalker listened intently, his eyes following the text. When I finished, he made a sound of approval and pulled out another book. We spent an hour like that, Cloudwalker bringing books, me reading, him absorbing the stories. I learned about their daily life. They rose with the sun and slept shortly after dark. They foraged for food, hunted occasionally, but mostly relied on plants, fish, and small game. They had territories they respected, boundaries they maintained with other Bigfoot families in distant valleys. They mourned their dead by returning the bodies to the earth, planting trees over the graves. They celebrated births with elaborate vocalizations that Margaret said was something like singing. They had art, music, story, culture. They had everything that made a society. By the end of that second day, I knew what my decision was going to be. Not because I wanted to give up my life, my career, my marriage, but because standing in that clearing, watching Cloudwalker sound out words from a book I'd just taught him to read, I felt something I'd never felt in 12 years of academic research. Purpose. Real, profound, undeniable purpose. I told Margaret that evening. She nodded, unsurprised. You feel it. The calling. Thunder walking was right about you. She pulled out a stack of her bark paper books. Then we should begin your real education. I'll teach you everything I know. The language, the customs, the teaching methods, the family dynamics. I have maybe 6 months. That's enough time if we work hard. Over the following weeks, I became a student again. I learned to speak their language with increasing fluency. I learned to read their social cues, their body language, their complex emotional expressions. I learned to teach literacy using Margaret's methods, adapted for beings who didn't have the same vocal apparatus as humans, but who could learn to recognize written words and associate them with concepts. The learning curve was steep. The Bigfoot language had sounds I struggled to produce, subtle variations in pitch and duration that changed meaning entirely. Thunder walking was patient but exacting. He would repeat a phrase 5, 10, 15 times until I could approximate it properly. The juveniles would gather to watch these lessons, their huffing laughter echoing when I mangled a pronunciation particularly badly. But they also celebrated my progress. When I finally mastered a difficult vocalization after 3 weeks of practice, the whole family made sounds of approval that Margaret told me was the equivalent of applause. I learned their alphabet too, not the Roman letters I was teaching them, but their own system of marks and symbols they'd been using for generations. They had a written language, crude but functional, carved into bark and stone. It was pictographic mostly, but it had grammar, structure, consistent rules. Margaret had been documenting it for years. She showed me tablets covered in their writing, explaining the meanings, the contexts, the evolution of certain symbols over time. They had literacy before I arrived, she explained one evening. Not the way humans think of literacy, but they could record information, share it across distance and time, teach it to young ones. I didn't invent their writing system. I just introduced them to another one, gave them access to human knowledge through human symbols. That's the gift, Dr. Whitlock. Not literacy itself, but access to a wider world of recorded knowledge. I told Robert what I was doing. He nodded, unsurprised. The elders will be glad. Margaret needs a successor. The teaching is too important to let die with her. He helped me establish a cover story. I told the university I was extending my research indefinitely, taking a sabbatical to pursue an independent project. They were disappointed, but academic sabbaticals weren't unusual. I told Linda the truth, or part of it, that I'd found something extraordinary in these mountains, something that demanded my full attention, something I couldn't walk away from even if it cost me everything else. We had a long, painful conversation over a crackling phone line. She said she'd always known I'd eventually choose my work over our marriage, that she'd felt it coming for years. She wasn't entirely wrong. I'd been distant, distracted, always thinking about the next research project, the next paper, the next academic achievement. But this was different. This wasn't about achievement. This was about doing something that mattered in a way I'd never experienced before. I need to do this, I told her. I can't explain why in a way that will make sense, but if I walk away from this, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. And if you stay, you'll lose me, she said quietly. I know, and I'm sorry. You deserve better than a husband who loves his work more than his marriage. The divorce papers arrived in December. I signed them in Margaret's shelter, by firelight, surrounded by handmade books and the sounds of the forest at night. Margaret put her hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry. I know what this costs. It's worth it, I said, and meant it. Because by then, I'd experienced what Margaret had found 22 years earlier. The profound satisfaction of teaching someone who genuinely wants to learn. the joy of watching a student's face light up with understanding. The privilege of being trusted by beings who had every reason to fear humans but had chosen instead to accept me as Margaret had been accepted. I was teaching morning dew's children regularly by then. Mist, the 6-year-old, was learning her letters with the same careful attention her mother brought to teaching plant identification. Stone, 8 years old, was already reading simple sentences and asking me questions about the words. "Why does night have a K if you don't say the K?" he asked one day. Through vocalizations I'd learned to understand. I tried to explain English etymology, the history of borrowed words and spelling conventions, and ended up giving an impromptu lesson on how languages evolve. Stone listened, fascinated, then asked if the Bigfoot language was also evolving. It was the kind of metalinguistic question that demonstrated he wasn't just learning to read. He was learning to think about language itself. Margaret died on a cold morning in March 2002. She'd been getting weaker for weeks, sleeping more, eating less. The family knew. They'd been saying goodbye in their own way, coming to sit with her, making soft vocalizations that sounded like comfort. On her last day, she asked me to carry her to the main clearing so she could see the whole family. I did, her weight almost nothing in my arms. They gathered around her, all 12 of them, even the youngest juveniles quiet and still. She looked at each of them, said something in their language that I now understood. "I love you all. Keep learning. Keep growing. Keep teaching the young ones. James will help. Trust him as you trusted me." Then she looked at me. "Make it count, Dr. Whitlock. Make every lesson count." She died with the family surrounding her, with Thunder walking holding one hand and me holding the other. They mourned in their way, with long, haunting vocalizations that echoed through the valley. We buried her under a young Douglas fir, the family helping to dig the grave with their powerful hands. I placed her handmade books beside her body, all except the ones still in use by the students. Margaret would have wanted those to keep circulating. That was 24 years ago. I'm 61 years old now, and I've spent more of my adult life in these mountains than I ever spent in civilization. The family has grown. Some of the juveniles I first met are now adults with children of their own. Cloudwalker is 38 now, a father, and he teaches his own children using the methods Margaret taught him. The literacy program has expanded. We have a library now of over 200 handmade books covering everything from basic phonics to ecology to mathematics to human history. I've documented everything, filling hundreds of notebooks with observations, linguistic analyses, social studies, educational outcomes. It's the most comprehensive ethnography of a non-human intelligent species ever compiled, and it will probably never be published. That's the choice I made. Protection over recognition, service over achievement. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd made a different choice that day in September 2001. If I'd documented what I'd found and published it, I'd probably be famous, or infamous, or dismissed as a fraud. The family would certainly have been discovered, disrupted, possibly destroyed, and I would have missed 24 years of the most meaningful work I've ever done. I still live in Margaret's shelter most of the year, though I've improved it somewhat. I make periodic trips to Darrington for supplies, maintaining the cover story that I'm a reclusive researcher. Robert passed away 5 years ago, but his daughter knows the truth and helps maintain the protection. The Sauk-Suiattle tribe continues their centuries-old guardianship of these mountains and the family within them. I'm teaching the 4th generation of students now. Mist and Stone, Morning Dew's children, are adults with their own young ones. I teach their children the alphabet, watch them sound out words, see their faces light up when they recognize a written word, and connect it to meaning. It never gets old. Every time a young Bigfoot successfully reads a sentence for the first time, I think of Margaret and her patient dedication to giving these children tools to understand their world. Thunder Walking died 3 years ago, old age and a fall that injured him too severely to recover. Before he passed, he called me to his side and spoke to me at length. He thanked me for continuing Margaret's work. He said that teaching the young ones to read and write was teaching them to think about thinking, to question, to analyze, to understand complexity. He said this would help them survive in a changing world. He made me promise to continue as long as I was able. I keep that promise. Every morning I wake in this shelter, make fire, prepare for the day's lessons. Young Bigfoot arrive, eager to learn, bringing questions and curiosity. I teach them to read, to think critically, to understand the wider world while remaining hidden from it. I teach them that knowledge is power, but wisdom is knowing when to use that power and when to remain quiet. This is my life now, not the life I planned in graduate school, not the career I imagined building, but a life of profound meaning, of real contribution, of genuine connection with beings who exist outside the boundaries of accepted science. I have no regrets, and someday when I'm gone, one of my students will take over the teaching. The program will continue. Because that's what education does. It transcends individual teachers, individual students, individual generations. It becomes a living tradition, passed down, adapted, kept alive, by the simple fact that there will always be young minds eager to learn and someone willing to teach them. That's the story of how a missing teacher from 1979 ended up teaching Bigfoot to read, and how an anthropologist who came looking for indigenous forestry knowledge found something far more extraordinary. It's a story I've kept secret for 24 years, and a story I'll probably take to my grave. Because some things are more important than being believed. Some things are more important than fame or recognition or academic validation. Sometimes, the most important work we do is the work nobody ever knows about. There's an old parable I heard once, long before I ever met Margaret or the family. A young student asked a wise teacher, "What is the purpose of learning?" The teacher led the student to a garden where many trees grew. "See that apple tree?" the teacher said. "It grows apples not for its own nourishment, but to feed others. The seeds within those apples ensure the tree's knowledge, its genetic wisdom, continues into the future. Learning is like that tree. We don't learn just for ourselves. We learn so we can nourish others with knowledge. We learn so we can plant seeds of understanding that will grow long after we're gone." Margaret understood this. She spent 22 years teaching not for recognition, but because the teaching itself mattered. The children she taught grew into adults who taught their own children. The seeds she planted grew into a forest of literacy, critical thinking, and understanding. I understood this too, eventually. My academic papers might have made me famous, but they would have destroyed what they described. By choosing to teach instead of publish, by choosing to protect instead of expose, I became part of something larger than myself. I became a link in a chain of knowledge that stretches back to Margaret and forward to generations of Bigfoot children who will read, think, question, and understand their world more deeply because someone took the time to teach them. That's what teaching is. That's what it means to truly educate. Not to fill empty vessels with facts, but to light fires of curiosity that burn long after the teacher is gone. Margaret lit that fire in the hearts of Bigfoot children. She lit it in my heart too. And now, every day, I try to light that same fire in new young minds, hoping the light spreads farther than I can imagine. We teach not for today, but for all the tomorrows our students will see without us. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about education, about intelligence, about what it means to protect rather than exploit the extraordinary things we find in this world, I ask you to do something. Share this story, not to prove that Bigfoot exists, but to remind people that real teaching, real education, real knowledge transfer happens in quiet places, without recognition, without fame, driven by nothing more than the belief that minds deserve to be expanded and that understanding is worth protecting. Comment below about a teacher who changed your life. Share how education opened your mind to new possibilities. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the extraordinary existing quietly alongside the ordinary, waiting for those ready to see it.